these institutions, but we're very, very grateful that Nina's here today to talk with us. As you know, Nina Simon has been working in the world of museums and talking about participatory museums and Museum 2.0 for some time. She's been described as a museum visionary by Smithsonian Magazine for her community-centered approach to design, and she's been working these ideas and implementing them currently as the executive director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, where she's been leading an institutional turnaround as well based on grassroots audience participation. And as you know, she's the author of the Participatory Museum and the popular Museum 2.0 blog, and I'd like to welcome her.
Thanks. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to spending this time with you. If you're watching on the live stream, I just want to let you know that, first of all, if you're in Toronto, there are a few open seats, so you could leave your desk and come down to the Textile Museum if you want. And then, second of all, we're going to spend a lot of this time in Q&A, and so if you want to send in a question via Twitter, you can send it into TMC Toronto, Textile Museum Canada Toronto, and it'll get translated out. Because I focus so much on audience participation, I like to eat my own dog food with talks, so we're going to split this time in half, or really we're going to split an hour in half. The first half, I'm going to share with you some ideas and some stories about what's been going on at my museum in Santa Cruz, and then the second half we'll open it up to questions and comments, anything you'd like to talk about. I have a computer full of photographs and stories and examples of lots of different things, so I'm happy to share those. And this participatory approach means that we are now entering into a social contract where if there is nothing in the first half of this talk that is interesting or useful to you, it is incumbent upon you to make the second half of the talk valuable. So please join me in making this a really productive and wonderful hour. And thanks again to Shauna and the Textile Museum for hosting this. One last logistic note that may be hard to see. My Twitter handle is at the bottom of the screen here. It's Nina K. Simon, and you're welcome to get in touch with me anytime. So I like to be really upfront about where I come from in doing this kind of work, and my orientation increasingly is as an activist. I believe strongly that museums have huge potential to have incredible impact on how we engage in our communities, how we see ourselves as creative agents, as knowledge seekers, as cultural producers, and how we connect with other people in our communities. But I think for the most part, museums don't fulfill that potential, and I am an advocate and an activist for that change to happen. And the reason I'm so impassioned about this is because I think for most people in this world, museums are not seen as these fabulous community gathering places that I think all of us feel that they can and should be. In fact, I think a lot of people think of museums kind of like this, as elitist places that belong to the 1%. This is, of course, not unique to museums. Theaters, symphonies, lots of traditional arts institutions are struggling to prove their relevance in a world where they are seen as elitist places for wealthy people. In the US, there's been a study that's been going on for over 30 years now of national participation in the arts. And they just put out their most recent data, and this is about attendance decline from 1982 to 2008. You can see that museums and galleries are down 15% in that time. Does anybody here like opera or ballet? Okay, maybe you should spend a lot of time helping them because they are in the most danger. I think we all know that these kinds of institutions are really struggling, not just financially, not just with attendance, but to find a place for their relevance and their meaning in the shifting world. And that certainly was the case at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History in California when I came to be its director in May of 2011. We had two really big problems at that point. The first was money. We didn't have any. And I mean, really didn't have any. When I started in May of 2011, we had $17,000 in the bank, we had $30,000 in unpaid bills, and we had no reserves, no backstop, no secret account somewhere, although I kept looking for it when I first came. But we had a second problem also that was in some ways more important, which was we had very little community awareness. Our building, the museum, is a fabulous building in the middle of downtown Santa Cruz that used to be the county jail. I think there are more people who know that it used to be the jail than who knew that it was a museum at the time that I came in 2011. And we looked at these two problems together and we said, gosh, this is really exciting. This is a time when we can really make a change. Our back's up against the wall, and we have a huge opportunity. There's nowhere we can go but up. As I said many times in my first several months at the museum, what's the worst that could happen? We could close. Oh wait, we almost did that already, you know. So we decided that we are going to transform our museum via 3 big approaches: active audience participation, bringing people together across differences, and experimentation. So first, active participation. We believe at the museum that art and history are something you do, not just something you learn about. And so everything we do at our museum is co-produced with community members and invites visitors to be meaningful and active contributors to the experience at hand. This comes from theories that I've been working with for a long time, and if you've read the Participatory Museum, you've seen these diagrams before. This idea of shifting from a traditional museum, where we have the information, we have the content, we push it out to you, the audience, and shifting instead to this idea of the museum as a platform that facilitates and mediates relationships and sharing of skills, expertise, and knowledge among participants. Some who may be staff members, some who may be experts, some who may be 8-year-olds, but that the museum becomes the convener and the facilitator instead of being the provider of all of the information. So what does this look like at our museum? Well, from the moment you walk in, there is a comment board where we invite you to tell us how we can improve the museum. If you put your contact information on the bottom of your sheet, we will contact you and we will rope you into helping us make whatever you dreamed of happen. We invite people to share their own skills at the museum. We currently collaborate annually with about 2,000 community members to co-produce programming. And we're in a town of 60,000 people, which means 1 out of 30 people in Santa Cruz is working with us on an annual basis to showcase their skills and abilities in some way at the museum. This doesn't just happen through skill sharing at events. We invite people to contribute to our collection and to our exhibits. And, you know, sometimes the things that they bring are a lot wilder than the things we would expect at the museum. So that's the participatory side. The second thing that we really focus on is this idea of bringing people together across difference, or what's called social bridging. Robert Putnam is a very fascinating sociologist who wrote a book in 2000 called Bowling Alone. And he talks about the decline of civic participation in North America over the last 50 years. And he talks about it in the context of social capital. And he says there are 2 kinds of social capital. There's bonding capital you build with people who are like you, and there's bridging capital that you build with people who are not like you. And one of the things he points out is that we have increasing numbers of opportunities for bonding experiences and decreasing opportunities for bridging experiences. I don't know about you, but in my town in Santa Cruz, the downtown is about 10 long blocks. Every block has its own coffee shop, and there is a different slice of people going to each one of those coffee shops, and never the twain shall meet. It's actually one of the things I love most about Toronto. I always feel like if I was going to live in a big city again, it would be Toronto, because when I come here, I actually feel like there is mixing that happens here in a way that's different than I think we see in a lot of this world, especially today as there are more and more societal differences that separate us. And so we decided at the museum, you know what, we know museums are already great places for bonding, for you to have a great experience with your family or with your friends. We're going to focus on making our museum a great place for bridging, for bringing people together who are not like each other, to build a stronger society through those connections. So that happens with our collaborators. Often with these events, we'll work with 20 to 50 different collaborators, really encompassing a wide range of skills and backgrounds. This is a picture of a knitter and a graffiti artist who both worked with us on a street art event a couple years ago. And this photograph is both a representation of a beautiful instance of bridging. When this graffiti artist got so interested in what this knitter was doing, he came over and they started talking about things. It's also a photo that is a disaster for what is happening off-screen, which is because this guy has left his graffiti station, there are now children with spray cans off-screen. But that's okay, we accept that risk. So we look at bridging in terms of the collaborators we work with. We also look at it in terms of our visitors and really inviting people from different backgrounds through the experiences they have at the museum to connect with people who are not like them. And then finally, the third strategy we use is what we consider fearless experimentation. So we really try and be courageous about finding new ways to adapt and change and experiment with things so we can see what we can do to be successful in a changing world. Now this all sounds pretty conceptual and nice, but I want to show you what it looks like in terms of numbers as well. So we're on a fiscal year that goes from July of one year to June of the next. And so I came to the museum in May of 2011, and this is a snapshot of our year that ended in June of 2011. So that year we had 17,000 visitors. Again, we've got a town of about 60,000 people. And that year, as you can see, we ended the year in the red. We had no money. So here's what happened a year later. Theoretically, there it is. We more than doubled our attendance, and we went from being in the red actually for 5 years in a row to being in the black for our first year. And lest you think this was a flash in the pan fad and then we went back to business as usual, here's the following year that just ended this past summer. We're on track this year, it's going to end this summer, to have more than 50,000 visitors, and we continue to build up what we're able to do financially. Now we've gotten to the point where we have reserves and we can start spending some of that money to go out and work in different ways in our community beyond what we've been able to do with kind of the spit and duct tape model. So these numbers are powerful, but what's also powerful is the sentiment and the energy in our community behind them. And this is just one of the comment cards we've gotten in the last couple of years from this person. I'll read it in case you're watching a live stream and it's small. Just a comment. Tonight, I'm amazed. I'm really enjoying the vibe here that you all have created. Santa Cruz is a hippie town in California. Your vision, energy, creativity, and community building have really added a lot to Santa Cruz. Every time I come to one of these Friday nights, I'm like, wow. Thank you. For me, it's really exciting to see the change that's happened at our museum, and that we've done this not with blockbuster exhibits, not with a new building, but by just opening up our museum and saying, hey, we want to be a place that doesn't talk at and teach to our community, but celebrates, engages, and really supports and works with our community to transform how art and history can be part of people's lives. So what I want to share with you over the next 15 minutes or so are just a few of the things I've learned from inside of this institutional transformation, some of the surprising things to me, and then we'll open it up to whatever you want to talk about. So the first thing I've learned is this. A revolution is not an exercise in concentric circles, and before we get to the geometric interpretation of what this means, let me give it to you very simply. Not everybody is going to like it. If you had ever told me, Nina, you will be the subject of a blue cartoon on a Sunday morning in which you are yelling at Michelangelo as he paints the Sistine Chapel that he should make it more interactive, let visitors color it in, you know, dumb down your work. I think we all know that this is kind of the core argument against participatory work, that when we invite visitors who are not authorities to be part of what we're doing, that it's dumbing down what happened in museums. And I say, thank God they figured out what we were doing and where the problem was. This represents about 1% of what's happening, but I just want to own the fact that there are people in our community who are not excited about what's going on in our museum. But here's a little bit about how I think about this concentric circles thing as it relates to this. You know, when we think about growth of a normal organization, I think we think about it this way. You start with a set of resources, whether that's visitors, collection, money, donors, whatever you want to think of it as. And then if you're growing in a kind of healthy, normal way, you go like this. You just get more of that stuff. This kind of growth I think of as very safe, because the center of what you're doing, your programming, doesn't have to move. It stays where it is and you're just expanding outward. In contrast, what happened at our museum in Santa Cruz is this. We started with these resources. We looked around and we said, you know what, these resources are not enough to sustain this museum. We've got to shift in a big way of what we're doing. And so now the people we have kind of look like this. Now there's both a comforting and a scary part to this story. The comforting part is the overlap. Most of the purple people stayed with us when we changed. There were only very few, really, probably even less than this diagram suggests, who decided that the change of the museum was not for them. However, the scary part of this is that to achieve this goal, to reach all these new people, to engage all these new resources, we had to recenter our programming entirely outside of where we had been before. And we had to have confidence that that was going to engage a whole new group of people that would also include some of those purple people, but it would be entirely different from what they had been used to and what they had been comfortable with. Let me show you an example of that. A program that really typifies this shift is a program we do called the Pop-Up Museum. And the Pop-Up Museum is an event-based program. It can happen anywhere in the county. And the idea is that you pick a theme, you pick a partner, and people bring objects on that theme just for that one evening or those couple of hours and share their own objects and stories about them. So here's a poster from an early pop-up museum we did last year, right before Valentine's Day. The theme was F My Ex, and we held it at a bar called the Red Room. And so we invited people to bring an object or a piece of art from a failed relationship to this pop-up museum. It is amazing, and you can imagine, especially I'm seeing the demographic, at least in this room, you can imagine that there were a lot of people in our town who were excited about this. It was a incredibly successful event. However, you can also potentially imagine looking at this poster, there were some people who this was not for. And we actually got a couple of emails in from members for whom this poster exemplified what they were concerned about with our change. They felt that not only were we being irreverent about what a museum was, we were also being offensive. By the way, I learned from this that the letter F is just a letter you should avoid in programming. This year for Valentine's Day, we're doing a Missed Connections one instead. But anyway, so we got a couple of these concerns in from members, and I asked the woman, Nora, who runs the Pop-Up Museum program, to write a blog post for our website about it, which she did, and we got this really interesting comment on that blog post. Here it is. So it was this guy who said, "I'm closer to the stodgy traditional museum supporter than to the audiences you are currently trying to reach, but I strongly support your outreach and attempts to involve new communities. It's precisely because of that outreach that I finally became a museum member last year. There was no reason to do so before since the museum was doing nothing. I still have little occasion to go to the museum, but I'm willing to support it as an important community resource." To me, this is really fascinating because this is a guy who is identifying as a Purple Circle person who never was involved when we were the Purple Circle Museum. I think that one of the things you can see from this is the repositioning of how people see our museum now, not as a place that is just for a certain kind of person, but as a place that does service with and for our community, and that includes lots of different people, including people who may not be like you. I feel, I would say that my greatest admiration is for those Purple Circle people who call me up and say, "It's so great when I go to the museum now, there are so many different people there. There are so many people of different ages, there are so many people I don't know." I'll always remember, in contrast, a docent who said to me, "I see what you're doing with the museum, and I think it's the right thing for Santa Cruz. It's not the right thing for me. And so this is kind of the end of my time at the museum." I think that was incredibly generous of him to say. And I really feel like we're constantly balancing honoring the people who've been involved with the museum for a long time, but being very confident and sure that we have to change the things we're doing if we're going to really engage and support our community. Okay, second note on change. I think one of the things I see often that kills change is the fact that we say, okay, we want to take these big risks, we want to try some new stuff, but we maintain our very high standards of perfectionism as we do so, and surprise, surprise, that kills a lot of the trying in the action of it. So when I came to the MA, which is what we call our museum, I said, okay, here's all we have to do in our first year. We've got to make this museum feel more welcoming because people either describe it as an office building or a jail. And we've got to create some events that really serve a particular audience. In our case, we were talking about adults without children, post-college age, and families. But on this first side, we've got to make the museum more welcoming. So one day I walk into a space in the museum and I see this. There are some armchairs with wheels, and there's a sign that says Roving Armchair Tour, sit back, relax, and enjoy the art. I have to tell you, my background is as an exhibit designer, and I saw this sign in its primary color glory. My first thought was, oh, this looks like it belongs in a preschool. Take this sign down. We've got to redo this sign. And then, fortunately, I silenced that part of my brain. I said, nope, this person is trying to make the museum more welcoming. That's what we're supposed to do here. Don't squash that. And so I shut myself up internally and watched what happened. And I saw things like this. People really having conversations about the art at the chairs. I saw things like this. People using wheels to kind of scoot around on the chairs. And all over the museum, as we started to bring in furniture, we saw people feeling that it was a welcoming, comfortable place. It would have been so easy for me as the boss to say, we got to take down and change that sign. And I feel like one of the things that I'm proud of is the fact that we were able to really stay focused on what matters and to let go of some of those other high standards that we had, to layer those in later, but to make sure we were saying yes to the things we had to do first. Now that kind of relates and goes in tandem with this third note about rigor. A lot of times if you're doing experimental things, especially if you're loosening up your standards while you do so, it can look sloppy. It can look what is serious, what we call at our museum productive play, can look just like screwing around. And so we like to make sure that we're really rigorous about how we approach the work that we do. So, for example, when we do community planning, even if it's for capital projects, we make sure to involve people of all different ages in discussing what's happened in their space. I have a lot of photographs that look like this. I like to joke that any good community process involves very poor photographs of people sitting around tables talking to each other. It is not sexy, charismatic-looking work, but it's important work if you're going to really transform what you're doing with your community. The tool we found most useful in terms of supporting this rigorous through line is a tool called the theory of change, or a logic model. And a theory of change is basically just a diagram that connects the activities you do to the impact you want to have. Unfortunately, I think most arts organizations have a theory of change that sort of looks like this. I would say that this theory of change is not really sufficient for many reasons. First of all, funders are a heck of a lot more rigorous now than they have been in the past, and it's no longer self-evident to them that the fact that we do exhibits or that we hold symphonies or that we engage kids in school tours means that what piece is happening and you should give us money. I think similarly, though, and maybe even more importantly, internally, this kind of theory of change is really confusing if you're trying to change. And if you're trying as a staff member to figure out, how can I make sure the work I'm doing is helping us actually achieve our mission? So here's our theory of change. It's not a whole lot more complex. I'm sorry that it's a little hard to see here. But basically, we connect the activities we do to the outcomes of those activities, and then those outcomes we connect to the impacts we see in our community. So we have three different levels of this. The first level is about active participation, that when we invite people to co-create with us, they feel included and empowered as creative agents and cultural producers, and that leads art and history to be meaningful to their everyday lives. Our second slice is about social bridging, that when we intentionally program in ways that bridge differences in culture, age, and socioeconomic status, people build awareness, understanding, and social capital with people who are different from them, and that builds a stronger, more cohesive community. And then the third one is kind of internal. It's about adaptation, really. That when we pursue our work in a community-engaged, experimental, and courageous way, it allows us to innovate in the face of change, and that allows us to thrive and adapt in a changing landscape. Now you'll notice that for the most part on this diagram, there are not words like exhibitions or school tours or archives or things like that. And that's intentional, because we want anybody in our organization to be able to think about, how are the activities I do fitting into this side, and how do those relate to these outcomes and impacts? And we're actually just now starting kind of a 3-year process to really deepen this and tie it to evaluation so we can really assess how these things are connected and how strong the arrows are for different kinds of programs. Oh, I'm noting now that I believe the last one was note 3 and this one is also note 3, so my apologies. I have the degree in math, clearly that has paid over time. So exploit your distinctiveness. And I want to specifically point out a particular kind of distinctiveness that's common between my museum and this museum, the Textile Museum, which is size. I think a real loss in the museum field is the fact that small museums so often try to professionalize and act like the big guys and ignore the unique value that we have to do something that's much more idiosyncratic and personal than what can happen at a big institution. For me, the best analogy to this is coffee shops. You know, the whole point of having your own kind of community-based coffee shop is that it is not Starbucks. It's more personal, it has its own personality, you know the person behind the counter, and the whole success of these entities is built on the fact that they are not like those big transactional multinational corporations. And yet what I see often happen in the arts is that smaller organizations try and always level up to this professionalism of the high guys that is both more expensive than is necessary for us, but also ignores the unique value we can offer. So we really revel in our smallness in Santa Cruz and use that and exploit that as much as we can. We're very personal in how we thank people for what they do in our museum. when an artist comes to us and says, I would like to make a giant mobile for the middle of your museum and out of metal fish, I can say to him, I would like you to involve visitors. And he can say, I would like to give them sledgehammers and let them pound scales into the fish. And I say, okay, let's do that. And no, I don't think we need waivers. Let's just go. When world-famous artists come to us and say, we would like to have a sleepover in your museum with our performance art friends, and we want to reenact this John and Yoko Ono thing where we are in bed all day, and we can just say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I don't have a picture of this, but I have one amazing international land artist who once said to me, let's do something at this crappy little museum that I can't do at any of those big guys I work with. I'm like, yeah, that's what we're talking about. When a guy calls up and says, hey, I see that you're having an event called Art That Moves, and I have this bike that's attached to a couch, and it has lights and a boombox, and I'd like to bring it down to your museum and bike people around town with you to say, yes, that sounds like a great idea. We're able to make magic in a different way than a big institution can because we don't have the levels of bureaucracy involved. And while there are plenty of things we don't have that they do, we have the ability to create magic in this way that is personal and idiosyncratic to our community and that builds stronger relationships with our collaborators and with our visitors. Okay, so we've skipped number 4, and we're at the last of these notes now. And that's this. It's tiring to do this kind of institutional transformation. And I think for me, one of the things that's been most helpful in being able to keep going with it is to use a framework that I learned from a colleague and friend of mine and a real hero to me, my friend Beck Tench, who's at the North Carolina Museum of Life and Science. And Beck was hired at her museum explicitly to be a risk taker. The museum got a grant to hire somebody in exactly this role, and she was the one. And when she got there, she was like, all right, I'm ready to do this. And she realized very quickly that to be a successful risk taker, she needed somebody else. She needed a space maker, somebody who could give her not just the resources, but the time, the permission, and the buffer from the outside to be able to do this well. And as time went on, she realized that all of her success as a risk taker was really based on this relationship with this person who was making space for her. And eventually she realized, gosh, you know, the way I can enable and catalyze the most risk-taking in my institution is not to take all these risks myself, but is to become a space maker for other people in my institution. This is a model that I use and think about a lot in the work that happens in Santa Cruz. And the way and the reason we're able to work with 2,000 different community members to create things is because our exhibitions and programs team are not the ones who create all the programs. They're not the ones who have all the great ideas and put them out on the floor. They're the ones who create structures that allow them to make space to invite others in with their crazy bikes with lights and with their fish and sledgehammers and create opportunities for that to happen. And I want to share just one story about this kind of space making, which has really been exciting for me. So my museum runs a historic site that is a public cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in California, called Evergreen Cemetery. And Evergreen Cemetery is a fascinating place, as probably many of you know. California, a lot of towns in California, including Santa Cruz, kind of became towns because of the gold rush and when people came out in the 1849 and 1850s at that time. And Santa Cruz really became a town overnight, and Evergreen Cemetery holds a lot of the people who founded that town. Everybody from gold rushers to the first teachers, Chinese railroad workers, escaped slaves. It's a really incredible place. It also, by the time that I got to the MA in 2011, had become a really great place to do and sell heroin. The cemetery, the graves were completely overgrown with brush. There was trash everywhere, smashed headstones, large homeless encampments. It was just seen as a pretty dangerous place in our community. And early on in my time at the MA, I had sat down with a board member from the Homeless Services Center, and we talked about, gosh, it would be so great to find a way for the museum and the Homeless Center to work together. And we just kind of had this as an intention, but we never really figured out what that thing could be. And then there were some volunteers who were involved with the cemetery already who were interested in really ramping it up to the next level. And my husband, who's here in the green sweater, became one of them. And we said, hey, why don't we, you know, the Homeless Center is just 2 long blocks away from here. Why don't we get together with them and see if there's something that could happen here? And so we formed a partnership between our volunteers, mostly history buffs. My husband is the youngest by several decades of these people. Between these history buffs at the museum and homeless adults who now every Monday for 2 years have been going out to the cemetery to restore it. And they have literally uncovered history, discovering gravestones that we didn't know were there, clearing and making paths, beautifying the cemetery, making it a safe and really engaging public history space. At the same time, they're also doing this really incredible bridging, bringing people together across difference around a very contentious issue in Santa Cruz. Homelessness is one of the top issues in Santa Cruz, and I've had 75-year-old ladies, docents at the museum, who come up to me and said, you know, I never really talked to a person who was homeless before this project, and now I have a human face on homelessness, and it's changed the way I see this issue in Santa Cruz. This is the kind of social bridging that I really care about. And it didn't happen because I said, I have a great idea, let's make this happen. It happened because we made space and we had an intention and a theory of change that involved social bridging, that involved active participation, and could transform the way the cemetery worked. Now if you go out to the cemetery on Saturday, there will still be drunk homeless guys hanging out there. But now they are guys who can look up and can say, hey, did you know that was the first teacher in Santa Cruz? They are like the most eclectic docent-oriented. But they're also real community owners and stewards of the cemetery. I think when we talk about inclusion in our space, we always have to challenge ourselves with what am I actually comfortable with? What kinds of perspectives, what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of people do I want representing my organization, do I want as a part of my organization? Evergreen Cemetery has really challenged a lot of that for us. There's a woman who is a drug addict, a homeless person who's struggling to get her life back together, who was a landscaper in a former life. She plants flowers in Evergreen Cemetery all the time. We have homeless people who go and call the cops on other homeless people who are making a mess in the cemetery. These people are real community ambassadors and volunteers in the cemetery, even if they don't look like our traditional museum volunteers might look. So I want to leave you just with a quote that really drives me from a guy named Dick Hamming. He was a computer scientist who gave this really, from Bell Labs, he's retired, he's dead actually now, but when he retired, he gave this really incredible talk. And one of the parts of his talk, he was talking about this question of why don't more people do Nobel Prize worthy work? And he said, you know, the average scientist, as far as he can make out, spends all his time working on problems that he believes will not be important, and he also doesn't believe they will lead to important problems. I fear that this is often true of all of us, that we spend our day working on problems that are not really important problems, figuring out what we should put on the poster for the marketing this event, or you know what we're going to do to lay these things out for the next exhibit. And all of those things are an important part of our work. But I think that what drives us has to be an important problem if we're going to really make a change in this world. And so I don't care what that problem is for you. You know, when I think about the places that inspire me most, though, they are all working on important problems. I think of places like the Elsewhere Collective, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina, a former thrift store that got turned into this really extraordinary living museum and artist collaborative that takes this material culture and transforms it into art that engages their community. I think of places like Shred Labs in New York, which decided, you know what, we are going to radically democratize how contemporary dance works and invite people into a garage space where they can engage with real dancers every day. Or a place like Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C., whose founder said, you know what, I want to bridge racial divides in Washington, D.C. by bringing them together around poetry, around good beer, around spoken word, and we're going to do that through these cafes. I think there are so many ways to work on these important problems, and the challenge is just to find the one that you care most about and figure out how to make the space to not just make all the ideas happen from you, but to enable other people to join your movement and make the change along with you. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up to whatever you guys want to talk about. Thank you. I'm just going to switch off of this so that I can pull up images if we want for other questions you guys have. Who'd like to start? Yes. And why don't you say your name? It seems like this is small enough for you.
I'm Valentina. I'm curious to know if you've made any structural changes to your staff when you came to achieve those objectives.
Yeah.
What were those and how is your staff organized at the moment?
Yeah. I don't think I have an org chart easy to pull up, but yes, we did make changes. We didn't actually make a lot of changes right away with staff. We knew that we had people who had already been working so hard and under such duress with this financial crisis that We just kind of wanted to get things going and then evolve into a new path. So the key things that happened. So as you saw, we were in a horrible financial position when we started. I had to lay 2 people off right away. One of those was our archivist. And I basically said, look, we've got to focus on people, not objects right now. We actually have not refilled that position, even as we've grown other positions. Our, boy, she's had so many different titles, but the person who is currently called our curator of collections, who has been our registrar, assistant curator, has had different words. She now runs the archives as well, and while she doesn't do a lot of her own direct research in the archives, we actually have more activity and more research going on in the archives generally because of this collaborative approach. She has a lot more both community members using the archives, but also library science students who are doing graduate projects in the archives. So there were some shifts like that, shifting to having fewer focuses on the objects that we're working with. We are a museum that's a merger of a contemporary arts museum and a local historical society. So there had been for a long time this artifact of having like a curator of art and a curator of history, and we moved away from that to just an interdisciplinary approach there. But then the biggest shift that ended up happening was what we saw with our attendance growth is, and this continues to be true, our daytime is pretty much dead. Daytime is about 20% of our overall attendance, and almost all of our growth has happened through what we call community events, so programs of all different kinds. And so we were seeing such astronomical change with these programs that were really not just about being a social hour, but really about content experiences that just happened to happen in kind of an event mode. And so the woman who was at the time the director of community programs, we realized that the way she was working with artists and with community groups was the way we wanted to be working overall across exhibitions and events. So her job shifted to being a director of community engagement, and so she continues to run the program department, but she's also a key lead in the exhibitions team now. And so basically, anybody who comes who's interested in partnering with us starts in community engagement, and then we figure out, is it an exhibition partnership, is it an event partnership, as opposed to saying, okay, if you're an artist, you're tracked into this exhibition line, and if you're a community group, you're tracked into this event line or something like that. So I think that's been the big shift. We also went to a totally open office, which is getting challenging for us. We've doubled in size since I've come. We've gone from 7 to, well, I guess we're about 13 right now. But in the beginning, I found was really important as we were changing so much and as there was so much chaos, for us to all be in the same room. I like to say, you know, I'm not a smart enough manager to figure out how to change things if everybody's in their own place. And so it's funny that now we have these conversations about like, God, there are a lot of people in this one room, but nobody wants to leave. And so it'll be a really interesting thing when we get to the next stage of growth where somebody finally breaks out. But I don't know when that's going to happen. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm just picking up on you were talking about daytime, the group.
Yeah.
And my name is Madeline. I'm from Scarborough Museum, and you are our idol. We're talking about you every day. And you know, we often talk about the idea of what we can learn from community centers.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk about this with my museum colleagues, they kind of go, they just don't really get the idea that well, what is it? What is the magic of the community center that makes things really happen? And of course, it's being open all the time, right. And it's having you know, something of interest for everybody, and it's that feeling of welcomeness, and also the free aspect.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on admission and admission barriers,
sure.
And also on hours of operation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just note that the controversy about our museum locally is about this question of museum, or, you know, that place has become a community center, which is like, yes. You know, so there was a great comment card, I have a photo of it, that says, what is this, a museum or a community center? And then somebody underneath it had written, can't it be both? And it's like, yeah, that's exactly it. But it's amazing how much people kind of fall, you know, they get in these different camps. So, you know, on the hour side, I think it's really dependent on what kind of environment you're in. You know, I'm in a small town in a beautiful place. It is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit there today. And so on the weekends, when people wake up on a Saturday or Sunday, they don't say, what arts experience should we have today? They say, should we go mountain biking? Should we go surfing? Should we go to the farmer's market? And so at least for us, we're really questioning ours because we're seeing that the way people want to engage with us is to put it on their calendar as, oh, I'm going on Friday night because they're having that thing. And so we're finding that that event mindset has to do with how people plan their cultural life. But I think actually it's quite different if you're in a large metro area. And so I don't know enough about Toronto to have a good sense here. But my guess is that that is something that's unique to a place where we're literally the only museum in town, as opposed to a place where there is kind of a culture-going set for whom it is part of kind of their habit-forming part of their life. On the admissions side, so our museum costs $5, but about 60% of people come for free. We have a couple of free days a month, and then we also have a policy we call spontaneous free, which is basically if you walk in the door and you're kind of looking around like, what is this building? And you see, the sign that says $5, $3 students, and you're clearly deciding whether you want to try this or not. We always say, oh, if you've never been here before, come on in, be my guest. And one of the things we're actually grappling with right now is whether we should be free or not. Because one of the things we see is that free days and also spontaneous free create a kind of novelty. They make an event out of a free day, which drives a lot of energy. And then the spontaneous free is a gift that we can give people that's very different than if we were free all the time. On the other hand, I think it's pretty likely that in the next couple of years we will go to daytime free because the money part is so minimal for us. And we'd love to find a way for daytime to be valued. And if it's more valued as a community space and that's not a cash proposition, that could make sense for us. I think that's a big business question for us right now is sort of, is there value in daytime and we should really find a way to energize people around that? Or is daytime just a losing proposition because people are at work? So I think we're trying to grapple with that. I'd also say one of the big surprises to me has been about facility rental. I used to work at the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and when we did facility rental there, it was a business. Like, there was no programmatic component to it at all. And one of the things I've been surprised by is in a small community, when the Rotary Club rents the museum to hold their evening mixer, it is literally a community event. They want me there, and it actually has a real community value, which I didn't expect. There was actually a really lovely story about that recently where these two guys called us. So, gay marriage has recently become legal in California. And these two guys called us and they said, we'd like to get married at the museum and we'd like to just do it during open hours. Can we just do it? And, we don't want chairs or anything. We just want to do this. And we said, yeah, that's great. And we said, why did you want to do it here? And they said, well, we've been to a couple of diversity center events, it's an LGBT group, at the museum. And we felt like the museum's really welcoming to us, and so we want to celebrate here. And that was really interesting for me because those events that he was talking about were facility rentals. We kind of traditionally would think of those as a business thing. But to him, and I think to a lot of people, they don't discriminate or differentiate between I came here for this kind of event versus I came here for a museum event. And so we've started to look much more seriously at the programmatic element of facility rentals because we see that as part of this community-centeredness. And that also impacts ours because if we're available for a private event, we're not open to the public. How do we negotiate that if we want to shift to later hours? So things we're trying to figure out. Thank you. Are you pointing at somebody? Are you raising your hand? Okay.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I love looking at the graphs where everything looks better and better.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you look at those graphs, what is the dark thing you're afraid of that would knock you off that trajectory? What is the thing where you're doing risk assessment or conversations late at night with anecdotes about things that you're thinking about? Because all this optimism is just fun.
Yeah. Well, I think our tendency is going to level off. I mean, obviously, we're not going to keep doubling our attendance. I think that, I guess I don't, the fears are not in those graphs, I would say. I think actually it's more that purple circle, yellow circle stuff. And the fact that, we were very lucky that we had 2 years of changing a lot of stuff and getting nothing but positive press, locally and nationally, about it. And then, it was really just, it was really timed very well for just after I had my baby that all this, stuff started happening. And this controversy about, is the museum too fun? Is it too participatory? And one of the conversations that often happens with our board is really talking about how much should we honor those voices that are unhappy with what's changed. And it's easy for me to stand here and say, we know we're doing the right thing and we've got to just keep doing it. But it is hard to get phone calls from 90-year-olds who helped found your museum who are really disappointed in what's going on. And the thing I keep trying to remember and keep trying to say to board members who are more likely to hear this griping because it's their peer group more than mine who are talking about this is, how much time are we wasting on kind of trying to massage and keep these relationships going that we could be spending engaging a whole huge number of people in our community who don't even know that we exist right now and for whom we have so much potentially to offer. And I think, you know, a woman who runs Ballet Austin once gave me this great line. She said, bless and release. And I am trying to learn to bless and release. I think the other thing, which is more related to the charts, and that we're doing a lot of work on right now that I'm excited about, is I do have this kind of nagging fear that as we grow, our experimental, creative, playful approach will ossify into something that is not just structured, but becomes formulaic, becomes bureaucratic. And so right now, as we're doing a lot of the work to build those structures, we're writing core values, we just did a 3-year plan, we're really trying to make sure that we are doing that in a way that embodies and that actually creates a good structure to keep that stuff in place, as opposed to kind of becoming that mid-size organization that is less nimble and responsive and relevant. And so, you know, they have those curves, right, of nonprofit life cycles. And they have startup, and then they've adolescent phase, then they hit maturity, then they start to go into decline, and then either they die or they have a rebirth. So we went through the turnaround. We're done with that. That was the big thing for me about those little cartoons and stuff. It's like, hey, okay, we are back on the map as something else. People have figured it out. And so turnaround over, now let's grow. And so I think there's that question of, I'm fearful of the maturity part. And one of the fears I have about myself as a leader is that I might unnecessarily or inappropriately keep us in an adolescent cycle because I don't want to be in that mature state because it sounds boring, potentially. That said, as we keep going, there keep being more interesting challenges to take on, such that I think we can keep growing in a way that does not require us to ossify. But it's scary. Yeah.
I believe that. And I have a Twitter question.
Okay.
How can we get conservative museum staff who are resistant to change to consider an audience-centered museum model?
There are many ways. Let's see. So that's one way. I don't know if that makes them consider it or not. I mean, I think for us at the MA, it came out of a couple of things. First of all, crisis. Very, very helpful. And I think actually as the economy gets better, we are losing some of those opportunities field-wide. But so a crisis is a good opportunity. Also, the thing that allowed us to make all these changes at the MA was the fact that the year before I came, the museum had gone through this marketing assessment where they had discovered, oh, there's a small group of people who know and love the museum, and there were a lot of people who don't know about it or think it's an elite and unpleasant place. And that was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. The museum parted ways with the last director, and the board and staff wrote a new vision statement and said, we want to be a thriving central gathering place for the community. And so when I came along, I said, you know, this is a really powerful vision, but I only want to come if we're really going to do this, and if it's not just words on paper. And my guess is that most museums have some version of those words on paper in different ways, you know, safe space for difficult conversations, gathering place, town square, and I think that there's an opportunity to force people to live up to those words, especially if they're in your highest level strategic plan or mission statement or things like that. That said, I think probably convincing staff to do things is easier from a top-down than from a bottom-up situation. However, I think, you know, one of the things we did at the MA in the beginning was looked around and said, gosh, there are all these staff members who have been working so hard and been so stressed out. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a ton of interns in here, and we're going to get a bunch of new things started. And, you know, when you feel ready, when you feel like you have the space as a staff member to get involved, let me know, and we'll get something going with you. And it was a great day when we had a staff meeting at which there was a revolt of staff members saying, why are interns getting to do all the fun things? We won't do this. And that was so much better than if I had said, okay, you all need to change your jobs now to do this other thing. And so I think there are opportunities to lead by persuasion and example in some creative ways as well. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alyssa. I have a question about a participatory approach to digital content.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of my favorite museum websites and social media feeds happen to be collection focused,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome, especially
Yeah.
in the art museum. But how does that change when a museum becomes about its audience as much as it is about the collection?
Well, I think a lot of, or at least to me, some of the best ones are ones that are engaging in a way that is really about people engaging around the objects. You know, I love to use this term social objects for the idea of a collections object or an exhibit that really brings people together in conversation around it. And that can happen digitally and that can happen physically as well. And so when I think about, you know, institutions that are using Pinterest for their collections and inviting people to really share and reuse those objects, then people are taking on those objects as part of their identity, as part of what they want to express, or, you know, environments in which they're having conversations about objects. I think it's okay for the object to be the center of the conversation, but it's important to think about how can a relationship be formed through and with this object, as opposed to how do I make this object viewable but completely locked up in some way that you can't share it, use it, remix it, have conversations around it. So I don't think it always has to be about humans at the center. I think humans in relation to objects are often the most interesting way to get things going. This is not a digital project at all, but a project where I kind of learned a sort of surprising thing about that was in Milwaukee. Let's see. Milwaukee Art Museum. Oh, yeah, there's nothing in there. The Milwaukee Art Museum is an open floor plan museum. It's huge and it's quite confusing. And they were working on reinstalling their permanent collection, and I was part of this project to experiment around that. And one of the things I did was just walked around the museum and asked people, what would you recommend? And what I learned from doing this, so we would generate these cards, basically, where you would just put this card on the ground that says, you might like this, you know, go over there. And what we learned was that these cards were actually not very interesting. What was much more interesting was these people with their favorite objects and just kind of seeing, like, this teenage boy loves this portrait of Jesus, or, and his card said he's looking at Jesus like, you don't know what you're talking about. This kid who really loved this very intense contemporary art piece, or this guy with this Germanic, furniture. And so it was interesting to me that the cards on their own, kind of as tags related to objects, when they lost the humanness, it was not that compelling a project, but it was actually very compelling, these photographs of peoples with objects. And so, anyway, this is something I think about in terms of how do you balance that humanness with objects. For pop-up museums, we catalog them on Pinterest. We take photos of people's objects, and then we transcribe their handwritten labels into just the text underneath on Pinterest. And so those, there's no human visual, but there is kind of artifact of their object. So, I don't know, we're always trying to balance out kind of, I think as long as there's humanness to the project, it doesn't really matter where the humans are in it. Yeah.
I'm Susan. I'm the education coordinator here at the museum. So I had the privilege of taking all the RSVPs for today. And what was really exciting to me was to see how this event has kind of brought together our local museum community. And so because Toronto is a large center and because we have so many museums, I guess my question is, what advice do you have for all of us to work together rather than be so focused in what we're doing in our institutions? How can we kind of foster change within our larger community?
That's great. What I would honestly say is find a way to put together cohorts, to find other people who are interested in making change, and just be able to get together every couple of weeks or every month and check in on what people are doing and be, you know, constructive friends to each other in that process, because it's tough, right? It's not easy. One of my favorite stories of a place, and this is a single institution, but a huge institution doing this, is a place called Pukeariki, which is in New Zealand, where they have a museum, they have a library, they have an archives, they have a cultural center, a visitor center. It's huge. And they had some people within their organization who thought, gosh, we really want to make change. We really want to be audience-centered, but we are in this whole big bureaucratic landscape, and it's not going to happen. And what they did was they created what they called the Ruru Revolution. Ruru is the Maori word for owl. And so they made these little buttons with owls on them, and they basically said to people, hey, do you want to be part of our revolution? And people who were part of the revolution had these buttons, and they started doing some projects, and they had a shared blog together about the experiments they were doing. And when you look at that blog, and it still exists, and they're still doing projects, you see that at least in the beginning, it was like all about just cheerleading and just being supportive of each other as they tried to get little things going. It's now, a few years later, something with a heavy programmatic push across their institution in a pretty incredible way. But it started out of a few people in disparate parts of this very large organization saying, hey, I want to do something about this. And I think that could happen on a citywide scale as well, as long as, to me, there is an inverse relationship between meetings and getting things done. So I think it's like, don't plan a lot of stuff. Just figure out, what's something I want to do that somebody else wants to do too. Let's just kind of check in on each other and be buddies to each other. We do this kind of cheesy thing at our museum near the end of the year where we put into a jar projects we want to finish by the end of the year, kind of things that have been like on our plate for a long time and we never did. And you pick them out and you get a buddy. And basically your buddy is just like I had our administrative person who had install a new point of sale system. And so it was just I didn't need to know anything about the point of sale system. I just had to every once in a while say, hey Lee, how's it going with the point of sale system? And she did the same for me with one of my projects. And that kind of thing really helps, especially if this stuff is not within your job, it's not your everyday. Making that kind of time and making that kind of structure for it can allow you to do it and can give you somebody to celebrate things with, have a beer over the shitty stuff with. I think that's important. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just pitching briefly that if anyone's unaware, there is in fact an online Toronto Museums and Culture collective based on Facebook. I imagine many people in the room are aware of it, but seek us out, please, and we often put together drinking about museum events, and we're in fact able to secure a good amount of seats for tonight for members of the ring. So check us out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kat. Can you talk a little bit about your funding model?
Yeah. So our funding model has changed quite a lot. Let me see. Let me see this. So the biggest thing that's changed in our funding has been an increase in grants and contributions. And so I think what I can show you these 6 months, which is probably not that helpful. But we used to be. Okay, hold on one second. Let's look at the last board meeting. Oh, or Financial Jeopardy. We could play mock Financial Jeopardy. So we have an unusual setup where when the museum was built, the building next door, which is actually truly the former jail, became commercial real estate managed by us. So we get the rent from it, although we're also paying off the bond on it. So about a quarter of our operating budget comes from managing that office building. And so that's kind of always been the same. What has shifted a lot is that here's the first 6 months. Oh no, this is just Q2. Oh, year-to-date's in there. Okay. Sorry, this is just from our last board meeting. So if you look at our income side, office building, grants and contributions are the things that have changed the most. Our membership income has stayed pretty much flat. STARS is our annual gala. That's stayed pretty much. Actually, we've decreased that. We've made that a simpler event. Programs we make more money from, but it's still not a lot in the big scope of things. Facility rental has really gone up. Admissions and stores like nothing. But the two big changes have been in grants and contributions, and those have been in a very specific way. So the grants, we used to get about $30,000 a year in grants, mostly from local foundations, family foundations. Now we get somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000 a year in grants, and those are almost entirely from large national foundations, either private or public, that are specifically interested in innovation in the arts. And so in some of those cases, we are absolutely in their wheelhouse because they're trying to look at how do we make museums relevant in the future. In other cases, I have one funder who I went to, I said, look, you've got two strands of your giving, artistic excellence and community participation. We're never going to be an artistic excellence grantee for you, but you don't have enough in your portfolio on the other side, and we can be a flagship participation piece for you. So just as we have this language in our vision and mission statements about our community, so too I think funders do, and so we've been able to really connect with grant makers in that way. On the contribution side, we have been able to access some really wonderful new local contributors who see us entirely as a community service, which has been a really interesting part of our whole positioning. So when I talk locally and when we recruit new board members, we say, look, think of the museum as a community development organization. We're an organization that does a lot to impact in this community. And I get checks from people, and there will be notes with them that say, you know, thank you so much for what you're doing for our community. It's not the sense of, thank you for this exhibit that I love. We don't do exhibition sponsorships. We do very little sponsorship of individual programming. Instead, what we're selling is social impact, basically. And the people who are investing in us locally are people who are excited about the transformative change they see us having in the community. Yeah.
Was there a lot of change on your board?
Yes.
Changes?
Yes, there was a lot of change on our board. So one of the things I was proud of was our first year, our staff barely turned over at all, and our board almost entirely turned over. But really, it was not very acrimonious. A lot of the reason there was a lot of change in the beginning was the museum had been in decline and in stress for a long time. So there were a lot of board members who loved the museum, who had stuck it out past their term limits to kind of see what could happen. And so once I was hired, they were kind of like, okay, we got to this point, you know, I'm at my finish line, I'm past my finish line, go forth and conquer without me. So a lot of it was people who they had given a lot and it was time for them to move on. But then again, you know, as we recruit new people, one of the things I really try and avoid is we're not looking for people who see themselves as the prototypical visitor. You know, I think this is one of the biggest barriers to change, especially for arts organizations. You know, if you're a board member who gives a lot of money who says, I went into the exhibit and there were kids running around, this is not how the museum should be, suddenly you feel like, well, I can't, you know, I can't pursue the future of my museum, that's strange. And so what we do is we say to potential board members, we say, if you are going to join the board of the Second Harvest Food Bank, you don't expect to line up and get soup at the soup kitchen. And similarly, if you are on the board of the museum, you're supporting an organization that provides cultural experiences for everybody in our community. You're part of that, but you are not representative of or prototypical of that experience. And, you know, again, we love board members who say, it's so great to see so many different people at the museum. You know, I would like more and more, we're trying to, right now we have this big push around cultural competency with staff and board members, and us really getting to know and be aware of what are the demographics of our community, who's coming, who's not, and how can we learn more about the people who aren't coming instead of looking for more people like us and our friends to be here.
What's the composition of your board?
It's pretty big. We have about 22 people right now. I don't know what it's like here in Canada, but in the U.S., museum boards tend to be quite large. They can go up to like 75 if you're talking about a big museum, and those are pretty much just people writing checks. At our size, our bylaws say 18 to 30, and we want to be somewhere in the middle of that. We have a pretty strong executive committee of about 5 people who are kind of my go-to people. But then our board meets monthly. I mean, we're right in that.
Do you have like a community representative or
Oh.
artistic representative?
Sort of. We actually, this is something we're kind of figuring out right now. So we have a pretty, one of the things we got more strict with the board was kind of the basic requirements of being a board member. And one of those requirements is about fundraising or giving. And so we have a pretty clear $1,000 minimum give or get for board members. And this is something we've actually been debating right now. We also have another entity called the Creative Community Committee, C3, which involves a lot of people who represent different communities in Santa Cruz who come together to advise us and work with us on programming. And it's kind of this question of, Do you want a governance board that is strictly about supporting the museum, or do you want the programmatic element embedded in that? I think there are positives and negatives each way. So right now we've actually moved towards more of a straight governance and fundraising board, and then having other ways that program advisory comes in. Because frankly, somebody who's able to make a big check isn't necessarily a person who is the best person to advise on programming, and having a token community leader or artist on that board may not be the best way to get their representation. That said, one of the things I'm glad of is we don't have any board members who are giving very big money. You know, our board members give between $1,000 and $10,000, which is generous and fabulous. But I'm really glad that I don't have any board members who are dropping such big checks that we feel like their voice is inviolate. There are a lot of museums in the States, at least, where board giving might account for 20 to 50% of your overall operating budget. For us, it's, you know, it's way less than that. It's more like 4% or something like that. So that also makes me feel comfortable with that balance. But it's something we're still trying to kind of figure out. Yeah.
I know you talked about how you've been shifting the focus away from actual objects in the museum. But I was just wondering if there are any ways you can work to get the community involved with the collection itself in storage, and not just the archives, but the actual objects.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're not saying we're shifting away from objects. I would say that in terms of our professional staff, we want to focus more on how we invite people to connect with objects as opposed to kind of doing the direct research on the objects or the direct cataloging on the objects. So there are lots of ways that that kind of work happens. We have volunteers who work in our collections, but more interesting than that, actually it's often come through library graduate students who maybe they start with an inquiry to the archives, but then we discover there's this whole other thing going on. So right now we actually have this really wonderful project with several people who are transcribing diaries of 3 generations of women who lived in Santa Cruz who never missed a single day journaling, and it's like 100 years over these 3 women. And we have some ephemeral objects related to some of them, but not the earliest one. And so this woman who's been working in the archives, who's also an artist, has started working with some of our picture collection to try and create potential fantastical images of what this woman, Mrs. Lund, could have looked like. And she just did this installation, sort of an art exhibit right outside the archives of, you know, potential portraits of Mrs. Lund. So there's that kind of stuff that goes on. We also have a lot of people who are actively researching and doing work with our collection. There's this great local group called Researchers Anonymous that gets together monthly, and they have their hand in some ways. And then I guess the other big way is through the pop-up museums. One of the things that's been kind of surprised about the pop-up museums is we started them thinking it was about people sharing their own material culture, but we learned that actually the best pop-up museums are the ones where we also are bringing some collections objects, and it extends that validating component and also that link of your object is valuable, this object is valuable, you know, how do we think about these things in relation to each other? That's been really challenging for us because part of the whole point of the pop-up museum is to really democratize how people get to engage with the objects, and it's very, basically the objects are open to touch in most cases, and so we are constantly trying to figure out, let's see if there's a picture of them in here, I think, trying to figure out which of our objects can come out, how do we think about that, is it weird if our object is in a case and your object is not, does that value them in different ways, so we keep trying to negotiate that. I don't know. I think we're actually near the end, yeah.
Oh, you were talking about risk-taking, and I was thinking, you know, risk-taking is always amazing when things go well, but it doesn't always go well.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about an instance where perhaps something didn't go well in either your mind or others' minds, and how you kind of handled the aftermath and maybe turned it into a positive.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think that, you know, to me, we've actually been having a debate recently as we've been defining core values about risk-taking versus experimentation. Because one of the things that we've sort of realized is when you're in an environment that supports taking risks, it doesn't really feel like taking a risk. It feels like this is what we're trying now, what did we learn from that? So we don't really have a binary success or failure mode in terms of how we talk about things at the museum. That said, are there things that people perceive as not going well? Yeah, sure. Either we get those off the floor really fast because we haven't invested a lot in them. We do a ton of prototyping. We're always, if we can't decide which way to go with something, let's put it out on the floor in both directions and try it. And then it's not like, oh, this failed. It's like, oh, that's the right one. Let's use that one. I will say some of the surprises, and I do have photos of this, and actually Kevin was there. He can maybe speak to this, but one of the surprising events, we'll be talking about this at AAM, for us, we did this thing this past summer called Hack the Museum, which was a camp. I got some hack photos. Okay, here's some hack. Which was a camp where we invited people to help us make exhibits that kind of broke all the rules. And one of the things, I think a bunch of these are videos, which may not work very well. So over 48 hours, people took objects from our collection that we gave them, and then they had to make really risk-taking exhibits with them. And it was chaotic and a lot of fun, and there was haircutting that happened. There were people who slept in the museum. It was crazy. And in the end, there was this exhibit that was up for a month of all these risk-taking experiments. And one of the things I learned from that, it was a very polarizing exhibit. Some people got what we were trying to do and thought, oh, this is so interesting. These are experiments with what an exhibit can be. And we got a lot of visitor comments to that effect. We also got some of the strongest negative response we've ever gotten of, oh, this looks so sloppy, this is so thoughtless, what's going on here? And it made me realize that, especially when we're doing experimental things, we really have to scaffold that and help people up front understand what's going on. In the same way, I've fought for so long to say we need more interpretation in galleries because it's not obvious to people what this object is about or what the story is about. In the same way, when we have something crazy going on in the gallery, it's not obvious to people what's going on, and so we have to comparably do that. So that's something we've started even doing dumb things like on the Fridays when we're setting up for a big event, making sure we put out a sign that says, why does it look messy in here? We're getting ready for a big event tonight. The galleries are still open. Feel free to enjoy the exhibits and come back tonight for this event if you want. But just adding those kinds of signs has helped us in kind of helping people with their expectations about what's going on in the museum. And I think that especially when we know we're taking a risk, we have to make sure that other people know that we're taking a risk too, and that's not always obvious. So I think that's probably a good example for us of that kind of thing. Yeah. Maybe we'll take one more. Or is there one more? Oh, there are two more. We'll do two more. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Juana. I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a bit about the measures of success that you set out before you do these experiments.
Yeah. Well, it really depends on what it is. So, for example, when we design prompts for visitor response, we have a lot of talkback walls in the museum. We're always looking for diversity and interestingness. And so we will experiment by writing lots of different prompts and trying them out with ourselves and seeing what we get. So, for example, for example, when we did an exhibition about love, there was this area about trouble in love, and we decided we wanted to do a talkback related to that. And we tried lots of different prompts. When have you struggled in love? Blah, 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 blah. Some of them were really depressing in terms of what we got. What we ended up with was this prompt which said, after the breakup, I ... And the stories we got here, these are just two examples I like. Were really, really fun. And they came from us experimenting and having a goal. When we look at visitor-contributed content, even the instruction we give to volunteers who are maintaining things on the floor is leave a diversity of responses, as long as they're not obscene or completely off, a scribble. It's good to have some that look like they're written by a kid. It's good to have some that are emotional. It's good to have some that are silly. It's good to have some that are specific, because it shows people there's a world of things that they can be a part of. We've actually, with talkbacks, now we have a pretty regular thing with exhibits of we just measure at the end, we just count how many were considered to be appropriate, meaning on topic and related to what's going on, versus spurious. And so we look for a high percentage of appropriate. And it's actually pretty surprising sometimes. And we have learned some things. We just had an exhibit with 3 talkbacks in it, and one of them did way better than the other 2 in terms of the quality of what people, or the appropriateness of what people did. And so that led to some good conversations about the design of that. So there's that kind of thing. On a whole other side, when it comes to something like bridging, we look at things like diversity of the people who are at the museum, and we're starting to do some surveying, specifically asking people, did you talk with anybody who was a stranger to you at the event? Were they different from you in gender, in age, in race? We're trying to get a sense of, is there bridging going on here? We always ask collaborators about what kinds of new opportunities were sparked through working with us, and we often have this kind of longitudinal response where we learn about new partnerships that were formed between artists because they were brought together in an event with us. So we're still kind of messing around with getting to a rigorous assessment structure, but we have a bunch of different ways we look at these kinds of things. And we also, again, you know, because we're so adaptive and iterative, it's less about here's the experiment, start it, go, we're done, and more about, okay, this month it kind of felt like this, okay, let's dial this up, let's dial that back. I think the downside of that approach is right now we're very intuitive because we're all at these events, and so we just talk about it afterwards. But as we get bigger and as we try and also involve our board in some of these conversations, we realize we need some more structured ways to share that assessment so that it's not just based on, God, it felt really, you know, high energy tonight, or felt really diverse, or what. I mean, and those conversations are useful. I value that, you know, that intuitive response, but it's not something I can easily share with a funder or board member. Okay, last question. Yeah.
So my name is Madeline,
Yeah.
and I was just wondering, you've obviously gotten a lot of feedback from people in the community and museum enthusiasts and just people, you know, all around the world. I'm just wondering what kind of feedback you've gotten from artists, and maybe artists who have exhibited in sort of more traditional museums, and whether there's anyone who would be interested in exhibiting at your museum and sort of maybe adapting their work to a more participatory.
That's a great question, and that's something we've gotten better at over time. So, one of the groups I would say actually that is most frustrated by the change at our museum is local artists who really saw the potential to have a show at our museum as the first step into kind of museum universe and maybe getting out of a smaller town and into kind of bigger city art world. And so there is frustration that, like, what happened to the possibility of a white-walled show for my thing that's very serious? And it's not going to happen. And so I think that's something that we are continuing to negotiate. However, what's interesting is what we find on the flip side is that artists who are very successful or skilled tend to be really excited about the opportunity to do something very different with us. So, for example, there's this guy named Thomas Campbell. He's an amazing, amazing artist. I first encountered him when I was consulting for the National Gallery in Denmark. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's from Bonnie Doon. He's right up the street from Santa Cruz. And he had never done anything locally before. And I came to him, I said, look, you show all over the world, but you live here in Santa Cruz. Is there anything we could do here that you can't do in those other places? And he said, well, I really love Santa Cruz, and I don't get to spend enough time here. And so we constructed a project together where over 3 months, he took our biggest gallery, and he built his largest piece ever. He was in residence, basically, at the museum. And it was a magical time for him and for us, and really created this incredible work. And so we try and look for opportunities to do things unusual. And there are artists who've been around who feel like, wow, I see that with your museum, I can really do something very different. And so that's great. One of the ways we're starting to accentuate that more now is with this thing called PPAIR, the Participatory Performing Artists in Residence Program. One of the things we had found was that while visual artists often had a lot of comfort doing interactive or participatory installations or workshops, that was something that performing artists had a lot more discomfort around. They were much more used to the, like, I'm on the stage, you're in the audience approach. And so we started this residency with some money from a funder where a performing artist works with us for 8 weeks to create a participatory piece at the museum. We actually just had one that I missed because it was last Saturday, which was a participatory opera, and I have this little video I shot. I hope I have it. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, you won't be able. Well, maybe if I hold up my mic to this, you can hear this. Oh, I think I just screwed up the mic. Okay, so pause this. Okay, so these artists decided we want to make a participatory opera with your community, and we were like, whoa, that's awesome. We don't know how you're going to do that, and so they did several weeks of different kinds of things, and this was about a month ago when they were writing the lyrics, and they invited people. They gave people a prompt line, and they had them write the rest. So this guy is one of the opera people who was an artist in residence, and this woman is a visitor sharing the lyrics she's just written, so hopefully this will work. And this is like a random time I just pulled out my phone. I mean, people were really engaged. And so the success of this residency has led us to now look at doing this for one of our smaller galleries and making it a participatory artist in residence program for the gallery development. One of the things we've really found that's been great with this is our core expertise on our team is about developing participatory experiences. And so by working with artists who have incredibly deep skills in their own practice, we're able to bridge together to create something pretty amazing for both of us that really serves our community. We also find that as more and more institutions are looking for participatory stuff, we want to make sure that we're empowering artists to build skills that they can then take to other institutions. And so having a solo project with a museum that also builds their participatory skills for a lot of these people has been an on-ramp to some pretty cool other projects. All right. Now we get to introduce my friend Kevin. Kevin is the reason I'm here, and well, there was this library conference too, but he's a real friend and a mentor of mine, and I'm glad he brought me here. So.
Cool. Okay, so there's good news and bad news. The bad news is our formal conversation has to come to an end because Shauna wants me to tell you that. And the good news is that there's a bit more time to meet and mingle over some coffee out in the lobby there. So that's the good news part. I am on the board of trustees of the Textile Museum of Canada, and when I'm not doing that, I work up at the Ontario Science Centre as the Director of Science Communications. So I have a relationship with a very small place and a relationship with a somewhat larger place. And I want to thank both Shauna and Nina for reminding me, and really probably everybody in this room, of something really important. When it comes to the work that we're all engaged with, it's not the size of your building or even the quality of your collection, it's the quality of your ideas and questions and the things you say and the things you want to speak with your visitors about. And I think this evening was a really nice illustration of that. So I want to say thanks to Nina again and to Shauna again, and we'll see you guys outside.
Great reminder.